Good evening, all, and welcome. Tonight, we delve into the horrors that homeless people can cause. So get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. I was 23 years old when I got a job working overnight at a men's homeless shelter in downtown Seattle. I am a female, and not a very big one, but I have a passion for helping homeless veterans, and felt comfortable doing the job of kicking out drunk men at 3 a.m. and having odd conversations with drug users. The overnight shift was from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. There were 30 bunk beds in a large space, so a total of 60 guests each night. One on the end of the large space, there was an eating area and a door to the kitchen. The kitchen space was similar to a public school kitchen, with a door to enter and a roll-up area to serve meals, which was open for only a few hours every night during dinner time. On the other end of the large space was the staff office, which had a small window to look out into the sea of bunk beds. 2 people worked the overnight shift each night, and most of the shift was sitting and waiting until morning. I'd spend time doing the dishes, or some paperwork, or getting breakfast prepared. When I first started, I searched the address with the Registered Sex Offender Registry, so that I knew which guys to avoid at all costs. I got to be friends with some of the guys, and I really enjoyed the job. There was one man at the shelter that no one knew anything about. He was taken care of by the guys there because he was vulnerable and seemed weak. He was a complete mute. The staff only knew his name. His paperwork had barely any information on it. His name was Raben. He spoke to no one, only nodded and gestured. After a few months of working overnights, Raben came into the office when I was working and sat down on one of the chairs. This wasn't something overly strange. Lots of guys did this to hang out for a little bit with the staff members. But Raben grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, "How old are you?" and then handed it to me. I told him that I was 23, and he nodded and left. His case manager was thrilled. He thought maybe he had picked me to talk to, and I would be able to get the general background information about Raben that they needed. My coworker, a female, said she didn't trust it, and I agreed with my coworker. I kept my distance from Raben, but the next night, he spoke some words to me. I tried to get his background information, but he wasn't interested in that. It was a short conversation about nothing, and then he went back to mute. The following night, I came into work and read the update log. Raben was in the hospital, getting deloused because he had scabies. I was incredibly relieved, because my co-worker was a frail old woman, and us against 60 men did not seem safe. At about 3 a.m., Raben came back to the shelter. He gestured for help to get a towel so that he could shower, then used his words to ask me if he could talk to me when he was done. I agreed and told him I'd be in the kitchen doing dishes. An hour or so later, he was in the kitchen door. He came in, and I instantly felt uncomfortable. We were alone in the kitchen with one exit. He leaned against a table directly across from me. He put his hand down his pants, looked up, and smiled, then looked back at his crotch, then at me. I told him, "Seriously? No," and booked it past him, out of the kitchen door and to the office. Soon, he arrived in the office and sat down. My co-worker was asleep at her desk, so I was still alone. I watched as Raven left the kitchen and went to his bed. The next few shifts, my boss had to be present to tell Raven to leave me alone. He would still silently lurk around me. I only worked a few more shifts before being transferred to a women's shelter. No one knew anything about him, and no one knows how exactly that could have escalated. I really did not want to find out. So, this crazy and definitely scary experience happened a few months ago. And today, I decided to tell the world about it. I had just left my dad's apartment after spending the weekend there, something I did quite often. I lived with my aunt because my mum passed away a couple of years ago. To get to my aunt's house, I had to take the bus from the bus station downtown, and to get there, I had to take a bus from my dad's place. Fast forward to the bus arriving at the bus stop at my dad's location. The bus doors opened, and I stepped in, paid for my ticket and sat down. The bus was almost empty except for me, the bus driver, and some homeless guy in the back. I didn't think much of it, as it seemed quite normal from where I'm from. The bus ride to downtown station was fairly normal and calm, and not a single person got on the bus. We arrived at the almost empty bus station, and I stepped out. Now, I knew I had to wait around 20 minutes for my bus to arrive, so I decided to go into a store that was just opposite on the end of the station. At this point, I'd forgotten all about the weird-looking man in the back of the bus and just went on with my business. I found a few things in the store that I wanted, paid for them, and left. When I came out of the store, the bus station was now completely empty, except for one person, who was standing in the middle of the street, just staring at me. To be honest, I got a little creeped out by this, but I didn't think that much of it. The person was probably just drunk or high. Next to the store is a small one-room building that is used as a waiting room. So I decided to go in there and wait. I pulled out my phone, and from the position I was sitting in, I could scope out the entire bus station and see everything. I was looking down at my phone and texting my friends, glancing up every few minutes to see if my bus had arrived. About 5 minutes had gone by, and I glanced up and was shocked to see the guy from earlier was standing in the exact same position, and he appeared to be looking right at me. Not wanting to look at him anymore, I averted my gaze and looked down at my phone once more. A few minutes went by, and I looked up once again, and the guy in the street was now gone, nowhere to be seen. I figured his bus must have come, and he got on it. But the weird part was that I didn't see nor hear any buses. But, once again, I didn't think much about it and went back to resume my texting. I glanced at the clock on my phone and saw that it was time to go. So I got up, put on my backpack, and walked out. When I came outside, I looked around and saw that someone, or something, was standing about 13 feet away from me, with their back facing my way. I felt a bit uneasy now, but I decided to find out if this person, or whatever it was, needed help. So I called out, "Hello? Excuse me? Sir? Ma'am?" There was no response. What I decided to do next was probably the most stupid decision of my life, but I decided to go put a hand on the person's shoulder to try and get contact with them. I slowly walked over, inching my way closer with every step, and when I was about 2 feet away from the person and was about to put my hand on their shoulder, they turned around. The person revealed themselves to be the man from before, the same homeless man I had seen on the bus. He had this crazed look in his eyes, and before I knew it, he lunged at me, and I narrowly avoided it. I screamed and turned around to run away, and when I quickly looked back, I saw that he had a huge knife in his hand. I screamed even louder and ran as fast as I could to the bus, which luckily for me had just pulled up. I climbed in and told the bus driver what had happened, and he and I went over to where I saw the man, but by this point, he was gone. This has been by far the craziest and scariest experience of my life, and I'm lucky to have never seen him again. I live in a relatively large city in Virginia that has a large university in the north side of the city. We have a rather impressive homeless population, especially near the university, and there's always at least one hanging out on every single street corner. We have our fair share of crime, like any other large city. This happened to me whilst I was still in college, about 2012 or so. On our main busy thoroughfare is the main event building for basketball games, graduation ceremonies, etc., along with the huge campus, Barnes and Noble, some restaurants, all of that. 3 lanes going both directions with a median in the middle. I was walking down one side of the road, up against the buildings going towards the bookstore, and a man, who appeared to be homeless, began following me, keeping up with my pace a few feet away, closer to the street. He popped out a pretty large pocket knife and held it so that the handle of it was hidden by his jacket sleeve. But you could see the blade and heard it when he popped it open. He was grinning, and he started mimicking my steps, the length of my stride. He'd stop when I would stop. It was almost comical. The way he moved, like out of a movie. He had some pep in his step, kind of sliding his feet with each step, almost like he was dancing the pace of us walking. He never said a word, just kept grinning and following and copying our movements. This went on for about 2 blocks, until I stopped at the entrance of the bookstore and stepped up on the 3 steps leading up to it. I made eye contact, and he stayed down, and he didn't try to follow me. Maybe he would have if I never turned to face him. Who knows? He suddenly turned in a rather dramatic fashion and stepped out into the road between two cars that were parallel parked. Where he stepped out had just turned green, so the cars waiting hadn't yet hit the gas pedal to go. He stood there just grinning until a car stopped in front of him and the driver yelled at him and threw something when he didn't react to the blaring horn. No idea what the guy wanted, or what he would have done if it had been night or something when the area was less populated. But I'm glad I never had to find out. I used to reside in the city of Houston. I grew up in the suburbs, but moved in a city as soon as I could get away from the strip malls and chain restaurants. I moved to Inner Loop, Houston. The 610 Loop is a freeway that officially separates the metro core from the residential and industrial outskirts of the city to a small historic neighborhood, the Montrose district, that was mostly attractive to college students, artist types, young people, and gays. Montrose is pretty socially liberal and probably the most out there Houston neighborhood, culturally speaking. Lots of cool antique rental properties and garden apartments for single and couples in their 20s, but not the kind of area that most people can afford to purchase a house or have any space for a family. I was very young when I first moved to Montrose, so I ate it up. The dive bars, restaurants, music clubs, coffee shops, street fests, proximity to the museum district. It was great, but every pro has its con. Montrose wasn't super scary, crime-ridden or anything. Or at least, I never felt unsafe there. But it was a little rough around the edges. Drugs were easy to come by, which meant a high concentration of drug users, obviously, and the behaviors they often came with. Car break-ins were relatively common, and my window got smashed twice in 4 years, which seemed about the average. There was a decent-sized homeless population to be berated by. Don't get me wrong, many of them were perfectly polite and harmless, but there were a good handful that were bold, shameless, and persistent. While muggings weren't the norm, to my knowledge, as none of my friends were ever mugged, it was definitely important to be aware of your surroundings if you were out and about, especially if you were alone or it was after dark. So one morning at about 8 a.m, I'm heading to work. I stop off at the drugstore on the corner of my apartment to grab a juice and some cigarettes before I hit the bulk of my commute. There's typically at least one homeless guy hanging out in this particular pharmacy's lot at any given time, but it's not worth worrying. They're usually passed out and no trouble, just resting in the shade from the structure, away from the hot sun. As I walked in, I see a grizzled, white homeless dude wandering around the far end of the parking lot, quite a ways from me. It seems strange, as they don't tend to panhandle here, as it's too boiling hot to be comfortable, wandering around on the asphalt in direct sunlight. Additionally, I didn't see any cars parked on his side of the lot, and no one's around for him to interact with, so his movements seem aimless and random. He sort of glances my way, but it's hard to tell from that distance if he's looking at me or not. From where I'm standing, it looks like his eyes are just randomly darting around, fixating on one point of the parking lot. Then, he quickly strides to that empty spot, and then he finds another spot a few feet away to look at and then skitter to. I don't feel threatened, but I am definitely aware of his presence and questioning his stability. I make it to Walgreens undeterred, get my stuff, and wait in line to pay. I'm inside 2 to 3 minutes tops. I step out the exit and glance towards my car, and feel relieved when I don't see Mr. Crazy on my end of the lot. So I start walking towards my parking spot. I've made it maybe 5 to 10 feet from the store exit. The car is another 20 feet away or so, when he seemingly appears out of nowhere and steps directly in front of me, blocking my path. He asks me if I have any money that I could give him. He's older and pretty worse for wear. I feel bad for him, but I'm creeped out and in a hurry to get to work. So I tell him what I often say to panhandlers, and it's usually true. Sorry, I don't carry cash. I step around him and keep walking, quickening my pace. I hear his footsteps following me, just as quickly from behind as he demands, "I know you have change." At this point I'm rushing to the car, a hair away from breaking into a sprint. "Sorry, I can't help you," I loudly respond, without so much as a glance back towards Nutter Butter McGee, who is still on my ass. I hit the unlock button on my keys and have my arm out, ready to reach for the door handle. My hand slides on the handle. I yank my car door open and jump into the driver's side seat of my sedan. Before I even am seated correctly, I immediately grasp out to slam the door and lock it, but too late. Psycho Sam is now facing me, standing in the space between my open car door and I, blocking it from closing with his entire body. My car was just your standard 4-door, so as you can imagine, I am now in awfully close quarters with the crazy. To make it even worse, he leans down so that his face is just about level with mine. His hair and the beard are unkempt, his eyes are wild, and, if I needed further confirmation, this is not a sane individual. "Give me all your money." He didn't point any weapons, at least none that I can see, or scream or raise his voice. He just sternly said the words in a very matter-of-fact tone, as if this were the obvious directive and my compliance was a given. I was terrified. I stared up at him for a second, not knowing what to do. In an instant, adrenaline slammed into me, and instead of immediately responding to his demand, I kept eye contact with him on my left side, while my right hand shoved the key into the ignition and turned. No, was all I could squeak. And that, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube, is the day I ran over a hobo's foot. And I would do it again if I have to. Seriously, screw that guy. I remember it was a Saturday night in 2016, and as the typical teenager, I was usually one to go out with my friends every Saturday until very late, or at the very least until the sun came up. One Saturday night, my friend Jordan wanted to order some pizza, but we checked the time and it was almost 12, so the Pizza Hut was nearly closed. My other friend, Lalo, had the idea to go to the 24-hour corner store that was just a few blocks away from where Jordan's house was. We all agreed, and Lalo wrote down the stuff that he wanted. Jordan wrote down the stuff that he wanted, and I wrote down the stuff that I wanted, just so that we didn't forget. Lalo and Jordan each handed me a $10 bill, and they told me to go to the store. "Why aren't you guys coming?" I asked. To which they replied, "We're about to play our one-on-one on Call of Duty. By the time you get back, we'll be finished, and you will go up against the winner." I thought that was dumb, but I wasn't scared or anything like that, so I accepted. I went out and made sure to close the door behind me. Fast forward 10 minutes, and I'm about to pay for all the junk food, when all of a sudden, a homeless guy walks into the store, and I didn't think much of it. As I was handing my cash to the employee, the homeless man taps on my shoulder and asks if I had any spare change. Obviously, I did have spare change, but I quickly realized that this isn't my money. So I kindly said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any spare change." This seemed to bother him, in which he went, "Oh, I see," and walked out. I made my way out the store with the bag in my right hand, when I noticed the homeless man standing right next to the dumpster. I had to walk past him in order to make my way to Jordan's house, so I did. As I was walking past the second block, I hear footsteps behind me. I turn around only to see the homeless man walking behind me, just a couple of feet away. 5 blocks down, and this creep is still following me. The 6th block was Jordan's house, but I didn't want to go there because this creep would follow me and knew where Jordan lived. So I decided to walk a couple more blocks just to see if I could lose him, or if he would walk in another direction. 7 blocks down, and he was still following me. Screw this, I thought. I'm going to turn around and walk past him to Jordan's house. So I turned around and walked past him. I must have skipped a beat when I passed him though. Surprisingly, he didn't do a thing, and I walked straight to Jordan's house without looking back. As I was at his front door, I knocked and they opened the door for me. I walked in, gave them their junk food, and started playing against Lalo, the winner. At around 2 a.m, Lalo and Jordan both had passed out and fallen asleep, but I was still wide awake and was playing Call of Duty alone when I heard the sound of his back gate open. I was curious and went to look through his kitchen window, only to see nothing but pure darkness. I turned on the backyard light, and my blood ran cold. The same homeless man I saw a few hours ago was standing in the middle of Jordan's backyard, just staring at me, giving me the most uncomfortable smile I had ever seen. He was holding something in his left hand. I couldn't make it out, but it had a particular gleam to it. I ran to the back door, locked it, ran to the front door, and locked it. When I went back to check the window, he was gone. I knew he was somewhere. So I got a kitchen knife and sat there in the living room corner where Lalo and Jordan were asleep on the floor. It felt like minutes passed, but when I saw my telephone, it was already 4 a.m. I figured that he must have left. I was extremely tired, and last thing I remember was passing out and waking up at 7. My mum picked me up, and we drove back home. A few hours passed, and I forgot about the incident until Jordan messaged me. The message read, "Dude, you won't believe this. My mum was going to get a shovel from the back shed so that we could plant flowers that she bought, when she saw a dude sleeping on the floor." My heart sank. I didn't want him to know about the incident, so I replied with, "Oh my god, really? That's crazy, dude. Are you both okay?" In which he replied, "Yeah, my mum called the police and they took him away." I was about to have a panic attack, but then I calmed down. After all, I was glad that no one was hurt or killed. Lesson learned: never go out late at night alone. The town I grew up in had an old sanatorium. It closed down in the late 60s, but the building was still there. In high school, everyone and their mum tried breaking in. Some succeeded, but others chickened out. After high school and a stint in the Marines, I found myself working private security, and what we mostly did was guard construction projects at night. Well, the sanatorium was slated for demolition, and the company that bought the land had planned on turning it into an apartment complex. So myself and a guy who had to be pushing 70 named Fred were working one night. Fred was a former cop from Chicago, and before that, a Marine. We often swapped stories, and we really enjoyed working together. The sanatorium was a hotbed for homeless and drug activity, and so we often had to chase tweakers or homeless folk off the property. That night, Fred and I were shooting the shit when he stops me and tells me someone just went over the fence. So we get out and head inside. Now it's important to note, Fred was unarmed and all I had was my side pierce. We also had pepper spray, a stun gun and a baton. So we are heading after this guy who was wearing all black and wasn't responding to our commands to stop. We hear glass breaking and realize this guy must have broken into one of the old administrative offices. We have keys to the doors, but the locks are old and it takes us a few minutes. Our protocol was to call dispatch and advise them of a foot chase, so Fred did that, and I swept the rooms with my flashlight and gun. I'm calling out this dude, and I hear an evil cackle. It sent a jolt of dread throughout my body, and Fred next to me turned white. I start pleading with this guy to show himself, telling him the company called the police, which they did not. Now the laughing is coming from behind us, and it's not one voice, it sounds like several voices. Fred literally pisses himself. He is terrified, and this is a non-veteran and former cop. Fred and I turn to leave, and I hear what sounds like footsteps, then the unmistakable sound of a gun cocking. I grab Fred, and we run for it, as we do more maniacal laughing. The cops finally show up, because dispatch couldn't reach us and called it in. They go in, and find 3 homeless guys, all of whom were armed, one with a gun, one with a homemade shiv, and the other with a lead pipe. If we hadn't run, who knows what would have happened. I am 22, and this incident happened a year and a half ago. I had just moved into my first apartment, and was in the process of moving in. The door that led to my apartment locks itself automatically when closed, so I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail while talking on the phone with my boyfriend. I returned to my apartment and sat on the bed whilst opening the mail while using the phone. I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under the bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person was under my bed and was lying still with his back towards me and his head to his chest, so I couldn't see his face, and he didn't see me. Trying to be rational while so many thoughts rushed through my head, I picked up the phone and said, "Sorry, I dropped my phone. I'm just going to take a shower. I'll call you back." The bathroom is right by my bed, so I hastily walked in, quietly locked the door, turned the shower on, jumped out my window as my apartment is on the first floor, and called the police. They told me to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anyone comes out the door of the apartment complex. This was during summer, and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car, whilst watching my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my boyfriend, and he came to me just before the police. I gave them my keys and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out holding a thin and very tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that had stood beside me and comforted me whilst the police searched through the house told me the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives waiting for me to come out. The man had somehow crept in my entry door whilst I was getting my mail and hid under my bed. The man that was trying to hurt me turned out to be a homeless person and was placed in a mental hospital. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day. I am a 16-year-old girl, and this happened to me last year, only a few weeks after I turned 15. For some background, my sister is 3 years older than me, and so this took place when she had only just turned 18. She had been dating her boyfriend on and off for about 2 years, Stephen. Just so you know, my parents are divorced, so I live with my mum, my sister, and my older brother. We had our house renovated instead of moving out when the house got cramped. You see, the layout is that there is a very small bedroom my brother has, a medium bedroom my mum has, and a large bedroom both my sister and I shared. Well, as we got older, obviously we wanted our own space, so my mum had a wall built in between the 2 large rooms to make 2 smaller rooms. The only problem is that you'd have to walk through one room to get to the other. At first, I had the room that would have to be walked through by my sister, so she was able to get to her room. Okay, back to the story. So my sister is dating this guy, who is the same age as our dad. Stephen also has a daughter, the same age as my sister. This guy was a terrible influence on my sister. She stopped going to school, went to raves, and was introduced to drugs. And all at the hands of her homeless boyfriend. Her boyfriend was very well known in our small village, as only a few years back, he had a huge drug raid at his old home. He also used to get into a lot of fights, big fights, and he almost killed a guy in a fist fight. He is also well known to furiously beat his previous girlfriends. So, no surprise, neither of my parents approved of him. This caused my sister to move and live with him. As ridiculous as it sounds, he has a tent in a wooded area. You see, he was living there because he became homeless, as I said before. So against my mum's better judgment, she invited him to live at our house, just so that she'd be able to know my sister was safe. I am a very reserved and shy person, especially around people I don't know. He was no different. Obviously, he had to walk through my room to get to my sister's, and I'd always assumed my unease and uncomfortableness was due to not knowing him. Fast track a few weeks later, by the time my sister turned 17, she found out she was pregnant. She was thrilled, but Stephen was not. My mum was disappointed my sister had gotten pregnant so young, but was happy to support her. One day, my mum finds my sister distraught as she tells my mum that Stephen wants her to abort the baby and had forced her to take a pill which would start the process. As bad as it sounds, I didn't really zone into whatever was going on at the time. I didn't realize I was slowly sinking into a depression. Fast forward a few months, and my sister and the boyfriend decide to keep the baby, and she had a growing belly while my depression worsened. At one point, I decided to try and tell my mum how I felt, and she ended up sobbing and blaming herself, which only made me feel absolutely awful. Safe to say, I didn't tell her again. As the months go by, things started to get a little weird. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find Stephen just sort of standing in my room. As soon as he was caught, he either rushed into my sister's room or went out of mine to go downstairs. As uncomfortable as it made me, I didn't bother to bring it up with my mum. We weren't on the best of terms, as I'd stopped going to school regularly until I was just not going anymore. The majority of the time, I would just spend in our shower room. One strange thing was the inappropriate comments on what I'd wear. I'm a well-figured girl, even from a young age, so the comments were normal for boys at my school. But it was weird coming from my sister's boyfriend, not to mention how much older he was. There was one particular item of clothing he had a liking for, a silk nightgown that was a little above the knee and have a small plunge in the neckline. As you know, I'm a reserved person, so showing my body makes me very uncomfortable. But I liked this nightdress because of its softness, so I did wear it a lot, but that was before I noticed his attitude towards it. To start with, he simply said, "I like that nightdress." I chose just to ignore it, but then he started to say, "I like the way you look in that," or "I like when you wear that." I was creeped out and just ceased wearing it altogether, never wearing anything revealing around him again. I went unbothered by him for a while. Then my sister had the baby, and me and her swapped rooms as mine was slightly bigger than hers. Me and my mum were constantly arguing, well, more of her belittling me and making me feel worse than I already did. So when my nephew was born on my birthday, I spent my birthday alone the whole day simply crying in my room. I hated living there and wanted to be anywhere else. A few weeks pass, and my mum and my own anger are reaching a boiling point, and I want to explode into an extremely awful shouting match. I still don't know why, but Stephen decided to try and get involved and also began to disrespect me. At some point, my sister pulled my mum downstairs to try and calm her down and left me upstairs with Stephen. He left my room and I assumed he went downstairs. Wrong. He had actually decided to shut my sister's door, come back into my room, and then shut my door. This is where shit hits the fan. Stephen completely blows up in my face. This terrifying 6-foot-something muscular man towered over my 5'4" small frame as he shouted things that genuinely left me terrified. It gives me the shakes, just recalling it. He screamed in my face if I were his daughter and I was acting like this, then he'd lock me in a room with nothing but my mattress, and I'd only receive a meal a day. He continued to go on about how disgusting and disrespectful I was. I was on the verge of a panic attack, I swear, and I blacked out for a few seconds out of fear, which caused me to fall into my bed. He was so angry that he was physically holding himself back to not punch me. I could see it in his face. He wanted to hit me so badly. He would cool his arm back as if to throw a punch but then stop when it came too close to my face. I thought he was going to beat me black and blue, like he was yelling in my face that he would. But the most disturbing part of this situation, the one thing he said I won't ever forget, was when he hissed quietly in my face that I deserved to be beaten and raped. After that, he walked out, and I sobbed against my bedroom door, terrified he would come back and keep that promise. The next morning was a school day, and Stephen decided I needed a 6 a.m. wake-up call and came into my room, picked me up whilst I was asleep, and then dropped me. I woke up terrified and in pain. He then crouched down to my face and said if I didn't go to school, he'd do a lot worse than that to me. He then went back to my sister's room, told her what he did, and they both laughed about it for a while as I was crying in the next room. I went to school that day, not even bothering to retrieve my lunch from my mum. Once I was in school, I go straight to my favourite teacher and proceeded to have a complete mental breakdown. I explained what had happened and how I was too afraid to go home. Social services was called along with my mum, and my mum told me the minute she found out what happened, she demanded that Stephen take his stuff and leave. After the incident, I was not allowed to go out on my own because Stephen had been threatening to kill me and set our house on fire. The house where his son and his current girlfriend still lived in. He had even attacked my older brother, who had to get stitches after having his eyebrow split open. Our house had to be on red alert, so if we called the police, they'd come straight away. After about a month or so, it went quiet, and he didn't hear from Stephen, and I was glad. Then I was informed that Stephen had been arrested. The reason? He had raped an ex of his, one that lived in the same village as me, and he was being jailed for a minimum of 8 years. It scares me to think, when he said I deserved to be raped, that he wasn't saying it to scare me. So, psycho ex-boyfriend of my sister, let's never meet again. This is the first time I have ever spoken about this. Even though it was over 6 years ago, it has changed my personality forever. This is not a made-up story. It genuinely happened and was actually featured in my local paper. But I don't like the idea of people knowing who I am. A little background for context first. I am a female and was 23 at the time of this incident. I was living in the house my parents left me when they died. My dad died when I was 5 from a stomach ulcer, and my mum died of womb cancer when I was 22. I am an only child with no grandparents or other family, so as you can imagine, it was pretty devastating to lose my mother, and I wasn't ready to sell her home, my childhood home, yet. So I was living there alone at the time. The way the house was situated was pretty perfect of any criminal behavior, I guess. Because although it wasn't isolated, with neighbors a stone's throw away on both sides, it was surrounded by very tall trees at the front and backed onto a forest. So anyway, on with what happened. The first odd thing that did not seem odd at the time was that someone was ringing the doorbell a lot. Very early in the morning that day. At first I ignored it because I was still grieving and depressed, so I didn't really care about the outside world at the time. Anyway, the person seemed to leave after about 5 or 6 more rings, and I fell back asleep. Cut to the afternoon. The doorbell rings again, and this time I can't ignore it because the man outside could see me through the blurry glass door in my hallway. So I answer, and this homeless-looking man with a huge backpack on the ground starts asking me about my home. He obviously wasn't part of any company, so thinking he's an oddball trying to see how easy it would be to rob me, I politely say that I am not interested and close the door. He stands there for ages, but I see him eventually leave and I brush it off. 20 minutes later, he's back. Thank God I locked my door, because I see him walk straight up to the door and start trying to open it. I shout through the glass at him, and he looks shocked and says he knew my mother. I just ignore him and call the police straight away, checking all the doors and windows are locked. While I'm still on the phone, I hear him using what sounds like tools and getting scared that he's about to break through the door. I stand by my back ready to run. About 30 seconds later, I see my front door shudder and slightly open. I panic, drop the home phone, and run as fast as I can down my garden into the woods, on the path, and run to a neighbor's street. I don't see him anywhere, so I assume he's robbing my home, and that's all he wanted. Slightly relieved, I knock on a stranger's door at random and ask them to call the police. The police arrive to meet me in the living room of this stranger's. what seems to be hours later, but was probably only 40 minutes. I go to the police station and find out exactly what happened. It was a lot creepier than I had anticipated. When the police got to my home, the man was gone, but he left a host of fingerprints and evidence, and because he was known by the police, he was picked up the next day hiding in a family campsite. He wasn't too obviously bright, and also had a long list of mental health problems. Everything from schizophrenia to manic depression. He used a long screw-like tool to break my door lock by hammering through, and once inside, he left a huge carving knife mark along the hallway, as well as muddy handprints and creepy carved out words on all 4 of the bedrooms.